First of all, I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker. She is the CEO of We Think Code. She has been an accountant. She is now an organization manager. She has tried everything. She is a sportswoman. Nyari Samushonga, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Najib. Really excited to be here. Appreciative of the opportunity to speak. And it's my first Craft Conf, and it's remote. Hopefully next time I can come in person. But happy for the opportunity to present my talk, which is titled Through the Looking Glass. And, you know, whenever you're about to do a talk, you think of a few different titles you might give it. One was, oh my goodness, how did I get here? The other one was, oopsie daisy, this is not what I intended. And landed at Through the Looking Glass because I felt the best way to convey the message of what I wanted to talk about was to really just be very open and share an expose of my own journey. And so this is not a conversation. It is a conversation about inclusion, but it's not the conversation where I try to convince people that inclusion is the right thing to do. I mean, you just have to look at the Craft Conference lineup and see the diversity of speakers in terms of gender, race, nationality, and the technical topics that they're talking about to understand that we're in an environment where everybody gets it. Inclusion is important. Inclusion is what we need to be doing. And more so, when I look at some of the people I really respect in tech, people I look up to, more and more you're seeing people step up and acknowledge the importance of inclusion and actively be involved in it. This is a tweet from Ron Jeffries a few months ago where he talks about his privilege. And he really lays out from his perspective as a white male how he sees this issue. So in that context, I'm at Craft Conf. The audience is diverse. The understanding of what we're trying to do is clear. I thought I'd do it more as a family chat, shall I say. Preaching to the choir is another way to express it. And say, you know, when you intend to drive inclusion, it's one thing, but to actually achieve that intention is another. And so I wanted to talk about how, as a group of people at We Think Code, which is where I work now, we're very determined to drive inclusion. And the journey has been bumpy for people that are well-intending, and talk about why it is bumpy and what we've done to try and actually achieve the outcomes we wanted. So I think at the core of our ethos as We Think Code, we're a software development academy based in South Africa. And we're driven by the idea that education is the passport to the future. For tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it. And those are the words of Malcolm X. And this is this notion that the tomorrow that we envision comes from us learning things we don't know today, implementing them, and then actualizing in the future. And so We Think Code, to give you a little bit of background, was founded in 2016. And it was in the South African context, which is very specific. And I'll share some context on that just to bring everybody else on the journey, which is South Africa has a history of racial segregation under a system called apartheid, pretty well known, which is a very methodical, very effective method of separating Black from white. It excluded economically, it stripped dignity from South Africa's Black majority. So South Africa is a country that's over 95% Black. And Black people were not able to participate in certain sectors, and they couldn't live in particular areas, etc. The legacy of that after 94, when South Africa becomes independent, is that you still have a situation of extreme inequality. So just to rattle off some statistics, right? While South Africa's population is 95% Black, the majority of the wealth hasn't changed racially speaking. And the patriarchal elements of apartheid as well have stayed with us, with a low representation of women sitting on boards. But currently we have a situation with unemployment, youth unemployment especially, where people aged between 16 to 35 in South Africa, 43% of them are unemployed. And then when you bring that down to 16 to 25, which is kind of that time when you'd be finishing university, youth unemployment sits at 59%. When a young person aged 16 to 25 has a university degree, 33% of them are unemployed, which is better than the 59, but still quite dire. But then in the same South Africa, in the digital landscape, we've got an acute skills shortage. LinkedIn estimates that there are about 60,000 entry-level software development jobs that are unfilled in South Africa. And so We Think Code was founded within this context where there's this gap between a large number of young people that are unemployed and aren't getting this tertiary education, and organizations that desperately need digital skills. And so the mission was, can we step into this gap, provide training to the unemployed youth, and then make them available to work in a professional setting in the corporate sector and address the digital skills gap. So everybody wins. The youth are not unemployed and the corporations get the skills and the talent that they need. And going back to the specter of, or the cloud of apartheid that still sits over us, when you look at those statistics around youth unemployment, they largely relate to young Black youth and mostly from low income backgrounds. And then there's the inclusion issue that we all know well in tech globally, which is women representation is also really low. So we sit below that kind of pegged at 20% women in technology. In South Africa, it's probably a little bit worse than that. And so we had a mission, a great mission. We're going to find youth that are currently unemployed, that haven't had access to good education because we've got entrenched income inequality. We will train them to be software developers over 2 years in a very rigorous way, so that at the end of 2 years, they're equivalent to a software development graduate coming out of university. And all these jobs that are lying around looking for someone to do them in the tech sector will be taken care of by the youth. And so that was the plan in 2016. We recruited the first cohort, and in 2018, that cohort graduated. And what could go wrong? So if you look at this next picture, and I hope it's not too pixelated where you are, you'll see something that's very fascinating. Firstly, it doesn't look like 95% Black. In fact, it was 47%. Secondly, it doesn't look like 51% women. In fact, it was 6%. And so you look at this situation where you have an organization like We Think Code, and we are literally incepted with an agenda for inclusivity. We are incepted with the intention to bring people together, and we are going to be those committed people that will destroy, the legacy of apartheid in our sector. We're going to play our part. That's the agenda. That's the dream. And yet we end up with a cohort that looks like the same corporate South Africa we're trying to transform. It's dominated by white males. It's dominated by males in general. Women don't really have a seat at the table. And when you look closer, the young women and the Black candidates that we were bringing in were struggling disproportionately. And so this is the preponderance on which I present this talk to you, which is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And before you worry, I'm not that morbid. I just had to present the quote as it is written. But the core of it was this view that it's not enough to mean well. It's not enough to want to do the right thing. In fact, it's not even enough to commit to try to do the right thing. Achieving the outcome requires a certain level of self-awareness, introspection, and honesty. So it's not common that a CEO of an organization that's there to drive inclusion opens up her talk with the picture of how the campus that was going to end the patriarchy and end the racial segregation is sitting atop an empire that didn't do exactly that on its first trip out. So we had to acknowledge that when we do not work to tear down the status quo, we essentially become gatekeepers of the status quo. And I know that this is something that tends to be controversial. I know often when I speak like this, it offends some people because, and this is the thing that's gotten very tense and polarized in this conversation and in this debate around inclusion, is it's either someone is racist or they're not. It's either they're sexist or they're not. It's either they're patriarchal or they're not. And if they're racist, they're bad and they cause the racial segregation to perpetuate. If they're sexist and patriarchal, they're bad and they cause patriarchy to perpetuate and women to not enter the stage and the scene and participate. But it's actually a lot more nuanced than that, because there are a lot of us that are in this arena that are committed to making the change we want to see in the world, and yet are struggling with it. And going back to We Think Code, it's a Black woman CEO. The board is gender balanced. Our staff team is gender balanced, racially diverse. We're from different countries. So how is it that a group of well-meaning people who are themselves representative as a team of the world they want to see goes out in the world and struggles to make that change? So I want to talk through when we were gazing upon our bellies and introspecting on our failures, what we saw as the problems that were underlying, and some of the conversations that I think, away from the polarized debate of racial exclusion, gender exclusion, and inequity, there are nuances that underlie some of the decisions we make when we mean well, that actually result in us perpetuating the status quo, and at that point, in some way, gaining some complicity in the problem, even when what we hoped to be was the change. So our value chain is super simple. We recruit young people, supposed to be a diverse cohort. We train these young people to become software developers, and then we pathway them to employment, because we measure success when the young people that we recruit, who would have been unemployed based on the statistics I shared in the beginning, end up gainfully employed, upwardly mobile, fulfilled and self-actualized in interesting jobs in tech, when they're doing cool things and actually driving the outcomes that they want to see. And so how is it that an organization that gets these holistic interventions that need to happen fails to get them right? So let's start with recruiting. So one of the things that we realized in South Africa is that prior education prevents entry into tertiary institutions. And I'll add some light to this. Under apartheid, South Africa had an education system that was equally segregated, what they called the Bantu education. And this meant Black children did not have access to the same quality of education. The quality of what they were taught was inferior, and then the resourcing of the schools they were in was inferior. Fast forward 94, it's independence, kumbaya, everything should be wonderful, only not. You do have some movement of certain Black people into the middle class, but across financial and income lines, you still have this divide where the legacy of these schools that were never well-resourced for people to learn well are still sitting in an under-resourced state and producing graduates from high school that are not really prepared for tertiary institutions. And so this is why they're not getting in, that and the cost of higher education. So we think Code comes with a great idea. We know what we're going to do. We won't ask you for your high school graduation certificate. We won't ask you for your prior education certificate. You don't even need to have coded before. The next thing we look at, aside from in recruiting the racial separation, as you saw in my first picture, was the gender separation. So you didn't see the white faces being 50% female and 50% male. You saw 6% of the entire cohort being women. And you realize that the next thing is that generally women haven't been invited into this tech space. They don't see themselves as future software developers. And the people that influence them, the parents, the pastor at the church, the teacher at the school, will straight up tell young women, tech is not for you. Essentially, women are interested in people, in the soft things, not the hard things like technology, right? And so that's the next thing that happens, is that they're messaged out of the system. And then when they would try to come in, they haven't studied the things necessarily that would prepare them to participate. And so our idea was, by removing the prior education criteria to enter into We Think Code, we will end up with an influx of young women, because you don't have to have had an interest in computers before. And by removing the cost of education, we'll have an influx of Black youth entering our program, because of course, we're just testing your aptitude. We give you a few games. Can you match patterns? Can you solve problems? Are you analytical? Can you hold a thought? And that wasn't the case, as you saw in the picture. Instead, we became gatekeepers of access through our tests, because we control the test. And a test that was intended to assess aptitude for software development became a test that favored white males. We found that 90% of applicants into our program that were white male got in when they came to our 1-week boot camp, where we introduce you to tech concepts and then make you write a bunch of tests. 90% of white males on our Cape Town campus that were applying were getting in, but only 15 to 20% of Black males and about 10 to 15% of women in general were making it in. So where we had intended to be the ones to break down this barrier, break through the glass ceiling, instead, we started to replicate the same gender diversity or lack of diversity, the same racial inequity that was in corporate South Africa. So We Think Code, on a mission to include, was becoming another arm of exclusion. And in this regard, I think when I say it that way, it sounds like, oh no, maybe that's not really fair. You tried your best. These things are hard. If the underlying education system is difficult, then it's inevitable that you would have a perpetuation of this exclusion. But then I want to give you a different example, moving away from technology and training. So I'm Shona. I come from Zimbabwe, which is a small country just north of South Africa. And it maybe has about 13 million people. Shona is my mother tongue. And so I think I'm decidedly funnier and more interesting in Shona than I am in English. And my family, my mother, my brother, my sister, and I, we speak predominantly in Shona when we're among ourselves. And that's normal. It's a beautiful thing, in fact, because I think when I express myself in Shona, I really feel like the heart of what I'm trying to say comes across. And Shona as a language is very descriptive. Where English has words for things, Shona people have sentences. So sometimes I think it might be a blessing that I studied in English, because any thesis, they would have had to multiply by at least 10 for me to get the message across in Shona. And I'll give an example of a Shona word. In Shona, in English, if you want to beat someone up, you would say exactly that. I'll beat you up. Don't mess with me. In Shona, you would say, Dinoko jambura. And what that means is, when I am done with you, you will be prostrate on the floor. And that's how Shona expresses itself. I've been an immigrant for about 15 years and haven't lived in Zimbabwe for that long. And so Shona has also become like a nostalgic way for me to connect back to home. And I speak to my family in Shona. But the moment a guest enters our home, and that guest is not a native Shona speaker or a Shona speaker at all, my family will automatically switch over to English as an act of inclusion. Not because there's anything wrong with Shona. As I describe it, it's actually a beautiful part of my heritage, a part that I'm very proud of, an expression that makes me who I am. But the moment someone else comes into the room and I insist on holding on to this thing that is beautiful, what I actually do is I weaponize something that was an asset, something that made me whole, and I weaponize it and use it to diminish the next person. And so this is me trying to give a more nuanced sense of how a We Think code that was trying to include groups of people that were previously excluded, low-income households, young women, ended up being a gatekeeper because we used a certain kind of technical test to act as a barrier to entry and became gatekeepers of a status quo. Let's go to the next step in our value chain of We Think Code. So first, we want to recruit young people, and we end up with a 47% Black representation in a country with 95%. And we end up with a 6% women representation in a country that is 50% women. The next thing we do is we train. And so let's look at training. We were convinced that we could take people with no prior coding experience, given 2 years of rigorous training. After having selected them the right way, these individuals would now summit, they would climb that ladder, the world would be their oyster, and they would do amazingly well. Alas, no. The next thing we discovered is that by bringing young people in and subjecting them to these large cognitive leaps, they were struggling to do well. So individuals that, like I said, in the Bantu education system that has been perpetuated after the end of apartheid, haven't had this robust learning environment. They were now struggling to scale up to this technical material we were presenting in front of them. Essentially, we had gone and inherited a training module or a curriculum from a French school, and it assumed certain prior learning abilities that were consistent with the French environment. And those assumptions translated into the project that you were presented to on day one. We were scurrying, running like little hamsters on that treadmill. We were going to bridge this gap, bridge that gap. If people were struggling, we'll do a workshop here, we'll do something else there. But the bottom line was that inherent in our curriculum was a cognitive leap between the person we invited into our doors and said, it's okay that you've never coded before. You passed our cognitive test. You showed these attributes that correlate to success in software development. You can do it. But then the cognitive leap was too big. And so young women disproportionately fell out of the program because they were less likely to have coded before. They were also less likely to have, indulged in the entry-level drugs to being a techie and a geek, such as gaming. And so they were essentially entering into this world and everything was new. And because everything was new, the learning curve was too steep and they couldn't summit it. The projects were too big and chunky, so there was no quick gratification. They got frustrated and they dropped out. Similar scenario with the young Black men that we were trying to recruit from low-income backgrounds, entering into our environment without the backing. The leap was too big. They couldn't bridge the gap and it collapsed. and they left the program in disproportionately higher volumes. So in this instance, we became the gatekeepers of what it meant to be competent. Through our control of the pedagogy of how we teach and our control of the content of what we teach, we essentially continued to shut out individuals that had proven that they had the aptitude to learn. And so again, we like to oversimplify it, which is, I put the material in front of you, the fact that you failed the test, the fact that you failed the exam, the fact that you failed to grasp the concept, that's on you. It's not on me as the person who presented content and a pedagogy that wasn't necessarily fit for purpose. So that was the training aspect, which is the second step in our value chain at Rethink Code. The last one is the pathway to employment, which is the ultimate arbiter of success. If truly we want to end youth unemployment, what we need to do is train people with skills that are wanted in the market. And how we know if the skills are wanted in the market is that our graduates end up employed and they keep their jobs. In fact, they should thrive. And many years later, they should be living their best life, sipping martinis on the beach, hopefully after COVID is over, and having a good time and a good party. Instead, this wasn't the case. When we were pathwaying our students into employment with our partners that fund the education of our students so that it can be tuition free, they had some concerns. Our students were not necessarily work ready. They weren't able to interact interpersonally. They weren't able to express the technical concepts, even if they understood them. And so in a work environment that's dynamic, where there's a lot of teaming, where the responsibility is on the individual, our graduates were not necessarily ready for prime time. And so it was chalk and cheese. The ones that were ready to fly, and the ones that weren't ready to fly. There's also an element of perception. And again, since it's a family meeting, I'll share another family story. My younger sister, and everyone in my family will agree that she's the brains of the family, is an actuary. So I remember when she was in primary school, she came home one day in tears because, she was always first in class. And on this particular occasion, she was denied the award for being first in class. And the explanation the teacher gave was she wanted to give other kids a chance, which deeply disturbed and upset my sister. She's always been hardworking, always been diligent. But that's the story of her life. She goes on to university. She studies actuarial science and becomes an actuary. After that, she worked as a strategic consultant and has worked all over Africa, advising people on entrepreneurship, starting new ventures, how to go to market. Late in her 20s, she decided that she was going to switch it up a little bit and go to university and do her MBA. She applied to a few schools. She got into Stanford. She got into Harvard, actually did a trip to the USA to decide where she wanted to go, and then picked Harvard in the end. And I shared this story not just to brag on my sister, which I generally love to do, but to describe the image of an incredibly competent young woman who has been competent and has put in the time. She gets to Harvard and she's working on a particular project with a group she's been assigned to, predominantly men in this group. She sits down, this young African woman, at a table, and they assign the work, they divvy the work up. My sister picks up the piece, which is the valuation of a business. Please remember, this is an actuary who's worked in strategy consulting and has advised businesses on how to launch. One of the guys in the group looks at her stellar work, which is, it's not just the maths is right. The lady can do a presentation. And he looks at her and asks, did you do the quants on your own? And so now I ask, if an actuary that has advised captains of industry and made it into Harvard is not credentialized enough to be taken seriously and adopted, what more for a young person that we've taken and trained in our environment and now launch into the world without the work readiness skills? Are they equipped to credentialize themselves? So in this respect, we became gatekeepers of culture. By not preparing our students for the world of work holistically, we perpetuated the stereotype that said they were not worthy. So not even in an environment where you've got the worst of cases where a young woman like my sister has done the work and is prepared fully, but in a place where someone is coming in with a disadvantage imposed by a structural inequality, we don't do the work and the hard yards of closing that gap. It's a much harder, much more intimidating world for them. And it's no wonder they have a hard time assimilating. And so essentially, we looked at it and we thought this is actually a technical problem. When the unit tests break in our code, we don't ignore the build. we don't accept the status quo, we fix it. And similarly, if you're within code and the value chain is broken, we don't ignore it, we have to fix it. But most importantly about fixing it is we've got to take ownership. And again, before everybody tweets at me and says that I'm trying to gloss over structural inequality is real. I'm a Black woman. I've worked in tech. I know what it means to be structurally excluded, even when you've prepared. And I've just shared the anecdotal story of my sister to reinforce my awareness of the fact that all preparation is not enough. But if we were going to shift this needle, and based on the distance between where we wanted to be and where we actually were, that dial needed to swing dramatically. If we were going to fix this, we needed to do the same thing that tech teams do all the time, which is we had to take ownership. We were making the choices to recruit a particular way, train a particular way, and pathway to employment in a particular way. And the choices we were making were essentially entrenching structural disparity. And we needed to fix that in our value chain. So we went back to first principles, went to the drawing board and said, right, how are we going to do this? So the first thing we tore up was our recruiting methodology. We kept the principle. And the principle is essentially this. When you recruit, what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict whether the person we take into this environment, and we only have 450 places a year, and we're oversubscribed. And because we're tuition free, it's a major opportunity to unlock a life for a lot of young people. So when we recruit, what's the question we're really trying to ask in a recruitment process? The answer is we're trying to establish if over 2 years, we've got enough time to get you from whatever your starting point is as a young woman who's never coded, maybe didn't even realize you were interested in code until We Think Code came knocking and said, here's something you should consider, play with these games. So essentially, we want to establish if at that point in time, you've got what it takes to 2 years from now graduate. And, I'm not what they call a witch doctor or a sangoma, so I can't just throw the bones on the table, read the bones and know for sure. So we're running this barrage of tests to try and establish that. So the first thing we changed in our recruiting model was we moved away from this idea that we introduce you to concepts and then we issue you an exam. And then depending on what mark you score on the exam, we know if you're any good or not. Instead, we thought, well, it's not so much about what you know after a week or 3 weeks. It's more about how well you learn over a period of time. And so with that, we said, let's take this thing apart. Let's rather introduce you to small concepts and then test you on the small concepts and then see how quickly you can grasp a small concept and move to the next one, grasp a small concept, move to the next one. So we're watching not just what you're learning, but the speed at which you're learning, because to get you ready in 2 years, time is of the essence. But it's not about overwhelming you with hectic complexity, but rather exposing you to little bits of it. And so we introduced this to our recruiting model. We moved away from presenting big projects, big concepts, big tests, big exams, and then just, sorting by mark, and started to ask smaller and more nuanced questions on what you were doing. The next thing we did is we introduced an interview, because most of us know that just after we learn something, we kind of understand it, but we can't necessarily write it down. Conversationally, however, we can convey the message. And so what we started doing was asking our applicants what they understood, asking them to draw it on a whiteboard. Suddenly we had visibility of the thought process. So the answer right at the end is wrong, but the beginnings of starting to understand this thing called code were there. And many professional software developers will tell you the pain of being asked to do a code review, being in a pop quiz where you feel like the interviewer is more interested in showing you what they know than finding out what you do know. And so we changed our recruiting methodology. And this was powerful. We went from a situation where we were struggling to recruit young women into the program because they were failing disproportionately at that 10 to 15% mark conversion in our boot camps, to a situation where now, from 6% in 2016, we're on track to get to 50% women in the program in 2021. And it's been a hard journey, but we put in the work. Similarly, our racial diversity has shifted from 47% in 2016. We're now sitting at 95% of our campuses are Black. And in South Africa, we are very particular about what we call Black. We have Black African, which is someone who looks like me. We have Black as being from Indian descent. But I think maybe internationally, you would more describe it as Black and brown people are now making up 95% of our cohorts. And then further to this, they're able to get into the program and take a seat at the table. So this is exciting because by looking at ourselves as the gatekeeper, as part of the problem, as the individuals asking the wrong questions of our applicants, we were able to correct the situation and not just paint or point a finger at apartheid, which is a real problem, but say, how can we take that as a governing constraint of our world and say, how do we address it? So we're getting brilliant young women into the program that have great potential, that have great cognitive ability, and that when exposed to these concepts within the testing environment are able to grasp them very quickly and rise up the learning curve through lots of little steps. The next thing we changed in our value chain was the training. Now, where before we were using a foreign curriculum, which appropriately for its context was assuming certain base level training, we had to look at it and say, nah, our students are coming from the world environment that they're coming from, and we know what their knowledge is at the entrance criteria. There's a concept in education known as learning edge theory. And it's this notion that you start to absorb new information at the edge of your current knowledge. And if the gap between your current knowledge and the new information is too wide, that gap becomes cognitively overwhelming and you collapse and you can't learn. So our training environment had to change. We took control of the training curriculum, brought it in-house, and had some local software developers that have worked in the arena for 20 years each sit down and figure out how do you, if your goal is to teach a young person who has never coded before, how do you do it? And what do you know? It's the simple thing. Small steps. Don't introduce them to big projects where they must build an entire website of something from the get-go, but rather trickle feed it. Start with small, discrete, foundational concepts, one after the other. And as they grasp one, introduce the next one. As they grasp that, introduce the next one. This allows an individual to access the learning. Having accessed the learning, they can now string together the concepts from one to the next one. We intentionally removed technical jargon from the first semester. So we describe things in English. None of these things that consultants like to do where we arrive at the client and we want to talk about the Kubernetes clusters and the AI and the machine learning and speak past our clients. We just spoke about code in English. Explain it in a way that your desire is actually to be understood. And guess what happens? Your student will understand it. This way, our students were building up to complexity. And what we found is within 4 months of training this way, when we presented the same complex projects that previously our students from low income backgrounds, our female students had struggled with, suddenly they were doing incredibly well in these same tests within 4 months than they had done when we had overwhelmed them with them right at the beginning. So essentially, by breaking it down into smaller pieces, we made the learning accessible. And we, reinvented ourselves quite like Madonna from being the gatekeepers that would not allow a new person into the world of technology to being facilitators of actual learning. And the statistics were fascinating. We suddenly saw that with the high motivation of these previously excluded groups, they were outperforming the middle-class students that had previously dominated the leaderboards on our performance charts. And this was exciting. And so we realized that by recruiting differently and training differently, we were able to get better outcomes. Now, at this precipice between pathway to employment and training, we realized that our campus had always been intended to simulate the work world, but something was missing. There was something in our world that wasn't exposing young people to the world of work. I'll go back to a family anecdote, family meeting after all. And I remember being really young in primary school. So I'd probably have been about 9, 10 years old. And my mother had this practice of, and I'm going back to times when if you had accounts and you bought clothes or something on credit, you actually went to pay them by check. So you had to write a check and you had to physically walk to the store at the end of the month and pay over the check to the person who was manning the till. And that person would then, record that in the system to show that you've paid your account for the month. But my mother would sit us down and I would literally write out the checks on her behalf and she would sign them. Having done that, we would have a to-do list for the month end Saturday. What were we going to do? We would go buy groceries. We would go pay the bills. My mother has always been a seamstress, so she'd want particular fabric that we needed to buy. We would go together, shop for the fabric, pick it all up and head back home. I shared this story to explain a context about how work readiness in many households is inbuilt in how people are raising their children. And so just by taking a keen interest in making sure we understood how managing your finances worked, how paying your accounts worked, what's a checkbook, how do you manage it, how do you pay over the bill, how do you plan your day, how do you ensure that given a whole bunch of things to get done, you get through all those things and achieve what you need to do, or as we might say today, #adulting. So I got to see up close and personal my mother adulting, and that ushered me into a life of adulting. Now, when you understand, again, going back to the backdrop of our world in South Africa, what was going on here is that you've got households that have been separated by migrant work when parents had to travel far to go and get work and were not there to train their students. Their education wasn't grand, so they weren't able to necessarily oversee and support the education of their children. Their jobs were not in corporate. They sure as hell were not in tech. So they were not sitting at the table and opening up their child's mind to how you have a conversation in a business setting about technology. And so we needed to break the cycle. How do we help our students learn to A, build networks, B, express themselves, and then C, have the confidence to fully take a seat at the table and not be timid and constantly feel like they don't belong? And on this one, we changed a few things. With the student body, on day one when they join, all first years are allocated in groups of 6 to a strong performing second year. And what that means is from day one, they have a technical mentor that they can start to talk to. So as they start to struggle and fear and worry, they have an opportunity to speak to someone who can support their learning. They can speak to each other. So when it's intimidating and you're not sure if you belong, you look to the left, you look to the right. We think Code has made sure there's someone you can talk to who can help you get by. And then beyond that, we also made sure that if they're struggling, there's someone who's watching over them. So before they know to ask for help, someone is going to offer them help and normalize the idea that struggling and failing forward is a part of growing and learning. Beyond this, we reached out now to the technical community, individuals like the ones that are largely in CraftConf right now, and asked them to mentor our students. So we match our second year students to a professional who's working, and they volunteer an hour of their time each week to speak to our students. They have conversations with them about everything under the sun. What is day one going to be like? How do stand-ups in the real world differ from the ones in our simulated world? I'm struggling with this technical concept. How would you approach it? I don't have enough time for testing. It's done, but it's not done. Is that okay? And these professionals and these experts are investing their time in teaching our students. Many of them are from within the South African context. And what this has also done is it's demystified the idea of what is this crazy software academy that takes people with no prior experience in coding and weak high school results and claims they're going to be brilliant after 2 years? Because up close, they're able to interact with them. And in so doing, they're able to normalize the idea that an individual from this academy can participate. And they become ambassadors for our program and make it safer for our students. So similar to what I described about the Shona conversation, where it's not helpful for me to love Shona and speak Shona to someone who's not familiar with the language, these people that are working in an industry, our partners, have shifted things around and started to participate in building. So what has this got to do with you? What is a story about a young woman sitting in South Africa trying to lead an organization into true inclusion where we recruit people that have the cognitive ability, have the passion and the resilience to learn, and give them an opportunity, essentially becoming facilitators of access as opposed to gatekeepers of exclusion? And then works with a team of expert technologists to build a curriculum that enables people to learn and thrive in a world they were not necessarily prepared for, to become facilitators of learning as opposed to gatekeepers of a world that has always excluded and marginalized particular groups away from tech, and then ends up with an opportunity to self-actualize in a world that we're working hard to make familiar with the competence and the capability of these young people. What has that got to do with you? I think when I looked at this journey that we've gone through as We Think Code, it mirrored much my own journey of being hired, onboarded, and promoted in technology. It's this view that we feel like we're not our brother and our sister's keeper. It's this view that if we can arrive and be competent, anyone who on day one doesn't look like we look, act like we act, know what we know, they're not prepared. And it's not about the fact that she's Black. It's not about the fact that she's a woman. It's about the fact that she's not competent. And yet, when we look a little closer, we start to realize that the construct of competence, the construct of belonging, the construct of worth is actually in many ways colored by the structural inequity that is in our world. So look at your organization and look at the way you hire. Does the way you hire expect people to arrive at the door looking like the people that are inside the building? Because if that's the case, then you will continue, like we did in the beginning, to perpetuate the status quo. If instead you go to the first principles and say, but what do we need them to know? How would you change your hiring process? There's a woman in technology that I really admire. Her name is Imogen Wright, and she's brilliant. She did her master's, I think, in astrophysics, and then, went on to do her PhD working on certain fascinating algorithms. But now the work that she does is in bioengineering, and it's really fascinating. It's around resolving the issue of drug resistance in HIV positive patients. And how they do that is they track and they monitor the DNA of the different strains of HIV. And she was on our campus presenting a talk to our students. And one of the students asked her, Imogen, what do you look for when you're recruiting, given that you do this fascinating, complex, and incredibly important work? And she said something that stuck with me, which is that when I hire, I know it's highly unlikely that on day one, I'll encounter a person who has the software development capability that we need and the biology knowledge that we need and the understanding of DNA that we need. It's impossible. So instead, what I look for is the curiosity and the track record of having worked hard and having tried hard. Because if the person is smart and they are curious and they are driven, then they can learn the things they need to learn, and I can work with them, and together we can make magic. And I think that was such a beautifully put thing by a humble person who herself is incredibly credentialed. And so the view is, in the way that we're actually hiring in technology, away from calling each other sexists, and gatekeepers of patriarchy and racists, are we having a nuanced conversations about the shona things that are normal to us and alien to our visitor, to say, how can we change the way we make people access our world? How can we ask the questions that are true reflections of what our world will need? The questions around curiosity, the questions around what successes they've achieved in their life that can be reflected in our world. The next question is on the way we onboard. I remember how I was an accountant for 11 years before I moved into technology, and then had the grand, bright idea that, why don't I become a new person? Tech is the thing. Let me go there. And the first few months were grueling. I went from being a senior manager in an auditing firm to being a fairly junior consultant in a technical firm. And in those first few days at ThoughtWorks, I would sit in rooms and my head would be spinning. Every word that anyone said made no sense to me. What's a build? What's an API? What does it mean to compile? What is runtime? What are tests? TDD? All of these things were strange to me and are, perfectly normal to everyone around. And all organizations are like that. Anyone who's worked as a consultant has had the same thing where you walk in and you're like, I know my stuff, but I don't know what language these people are speaking. Are we doing enough, having recruited people from worlds that are different from our own, to bridge that gap and allow them to sit in our world and feel welcome? Are we translating from Shona to English? Are we translating from the world of tech, the way we speak it, in a jargonous way that our domain has entrenched, to one that is accessible to different kinds of people? Because this is critical. And then finally, how do you promote people in your organization? Are you gatekeeping a culture that says people that look like this, speak like this, have been to places like this are the ones that are truly competent? Or are you looking at diversity and starting to understand that people from different perspectives express differently? They actualize differently. They're motivated differently. And so when they come into our world, they are going to present something that is different. And so I look at diversity as a melting pot. A close friend of mine makes an amazing curry. And every so often I pretend like I want to learn how to make the curry, when what I really want is to convince him to cook the curry so I can eat it. And it's always brilliant. But one of the things that I learned about curry, because before I met my friend, I just used to buy literally a box that says curry powder, and I would just put it in the chicken, and the chicken would become a curry chicken. But what I learned is that curries are made with many, many, many different spices that come together that make this rich flavor. And the truth is that with each additional spice that you put in, the flavor of that curry changes. And so it is with inclusion, that the journey for inclusion isn't about creating tests that make sure that we find people that are as much like us as possible and we stay the same on the inside. And even when we make the tests a little bit different, it's not about taking them through an initiation and assimilation journey that turns them from who they were to our image. Rather, it's a melting pot or a really good curry, where the more spices you add, the more the tongue has to discover, the more your taste buds get excited, and the more your salivary glands are like shooting out that saliva, like, please give me more. Because it's in that melting pot, that richness of identity, that encountering things and worlds and ideas and perspectives that are outside the realm of what you knew, that we start to build brilliant tech, that we start to build solutions like what we've seen with M-Pesa in Kenya, where mobile money in Africa has started to make banking accessible to people that don't have access to transport, but they have a mobile phone and internet, and they can transact money in this way and move out of the shadows of the informal economy and start to formalize trade. It's this thing, I remember watching one talk where a diabetic was presenting the many ways in which diabetics are taking control of the monitoring mechanisms and the software and the collection of data used to monitor diabetes, because by being given a seat at that table, they bring a view and an understanding of a user that's unique. A tech world that is one-dimensional is not equipped to rise up to the problems of today. A tech world that is diverse in gender, diverse in race, diverse in perspective, sexual orientation, that brings in people with an artistic orientation, a mathematical point of view, a musical one, is a technical world that is ready to meet the problems of today. And I think that that is the idea of what we're trying to do at We Think Code. And I think that many well-meaning people that are trying to drive inclusion are looking for. And so I'll end with this. There's an African proverb. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. It would be nice if we could wipe out the history of patriarchy if it never had been here. It would be nice if we could wipe out the history of class separation, where there's a monarchy and, the elites and the not so elite. It would be nice if we could wipe out all the histories of segregation on account of religion, on account of race, on account of sexual orientation. It would be wonderful. Unfortunately, it has happened, and we are here today. So the best time to plant our tree is now. The best time to sign up for inclusion is now. And the journey to being effective at that is actually to incorporate diversity in what we are doing. And that requires us to take responsibility, even as former victims of exclusion, as a Black woman in technology, and say, I am now becoming a part of the problem. I am not asking the right questions. I am not pushing hard enough. And I am instead a gatekeeper of the status quo. So I encourage everybody to think a bit more deeply, accept responsibility for some of the flaws, and start to drive inclusion from a very personal level so that it can come out authentic when we try to scale it. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Nyari, thank you so much. This is such an important topic that you've talked about, and you just touched big word problems, and you really narrowed it down to how you and your company are solving one of the bigger problems in the world, really. This is something that exists everywhere. And it's just amazing to see that you actually give a solution to organizations and companies. What you've outlined here is somewhat suggestions to what we organizations, companies could change in our hiring process, in our onboarding process, in the way we actually look for people to make this change. Because everyone talks about how the word is not good, but no one actually knows how to do it. And I have a bunch of questions, but we have also a lot of really nice questions, the way I've seen them in the chat. I'd like to start with them, and then I will ask some questions from you.
Okay.
Rene asks, regarding the less well-equipped schools, the not so well-equipped schools, does this also count for the education of teachers? Is it only a matter of money, or is it also a matter of how things are taught, how well the teacher is capable of bringing their own enthusiasm?
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic question. And I agree entirely. Essentially, we have, especially in the technical sector, like I said, I used to be an accountant and I'm in recovery. But you look at a world like accounting, and many of the things that I was trained, and I'll date myself here, but when I qualified as a public accountant, that was 2006, 2007. Many of the things that I learned back then are still relevant now when I enter a certain context to give accounting insight. Technology is a fast-paced thing, and you have a situation where the generation of teachers that are there now have not necessarily been exposed to the technology. And so the teacher does play a big part. However, what we found in the We Think Code environment, which is actually a peer-to-peer learning environment, is that even in equipping a teacher or a trainer, if you can make the problem smaller and into bite sizes, you equip the learner to be an integral part of directing their own learning. So you reduce that dependency on the teacher from being kind of a sage on the stage that stands there and gives you the answer to a scenario where the student has a little bit more agency to pull the knowledge in. Because the reality is, especially in a place like South Africa, it's going to be a minute before the prevalence of the know-how is wide enough that we can have great IT teachers sitting in our high schools across the country, making a dent in the system. So the next best thing is, how do we make it possible for people to learn on their own? And that requires people that are expert to take the time to create course content that is simpler and more accessible. And so that's what I would say to that, is that definitely the quality of the teacher, the enthusiasm of the teacher, the know-how of the teacher has a huge influence on the student. But the digital age gives us an opportunity to minimize the relevance of that and put agency in the hands of the learner.
Right. I suppose that what you've said is that it matters what kind of students you recruit, and you said that, and I felt like one important thing is that in our the way currently the world works is we are pre-judgmental, and as you said, that we want someone to be competent, and only then we want to hire them. But there's another way of looking at the passion and curiosity of the person. Do you also apply this to the teacher hiring process? I suppose you do. And what's your organization like with your teachers? What kind of teachers you have at We Think Code is my question.
Okay, so this is, we don't have formal teachers per se. What we do is our students learn mostly online. So we present problems to our students, and it starts off with a description of the problem they would need to solve and the mechanism that they will solve it with. We'll do workshops to kick off, so something like an introduction to Git, so that they get a familiarity with version control. But thereafter, they work on their own on the computers and deliver the solution. We also provide prescribed reading that we curate that is supposed to help them to understand what the problem will be. And then they submit the work, and then it's tested through that. The students also review each other's work and have conversations around how to solve the problems. As groups, they submit work, which is code reviewed. And so what you find is our environment, 25%, according to Stack Overflow, 25% of developers identify as self-taught. So we look at it more as a guided self-learning exercise. And that's essentially how we present it. And so the workshops that are delivered by experts are actually at particular intervals when we've got a big cognitive leap coming. For example, the first time we introduce our students to object orientation, or the first time we introduce them to TDD. We'll have a workshop that helps them philosophically understand the concept, but they largely learn through doing, and through a guided process that tells them, work on this, work on that, work on that, and then a peer network where they teach each other.
Right, I understand, yeah, makes sense. Interactive studying and learning. Our next question, Robert asking, do you have some pedagogic methodology concept to be able to measure the progress of learning and failure early enough?
Absolutely. So the pedagogy that we use primarily is it's a peer-to-peer learning environment. And in terms of the tracking of academic performance, like I described, the students deliver projects right at the beginning. It's weekly that they must deliver the projects. And the projects are there to teach a very particular concept at a very particular time. And as they progress through that, we're able to see through their application of completing little projects. The first one is you can do something for yourself. The next one is you can pull it all together. More recently, they were building a game, Turtle, and trying to shoot each other down, and we had fun with that. And then there's a demo where you see if it actually works. But the idea is that you're looking for two things. The one is the commitment to the completion of the task. Because in completing the task, there's a micro level of failure, which every software developer knows, which is starting off with the code doesn't even compile. And when we do these demos with the students, all of it comes out. They are 2 weeks into coding and they already sound like a professional, like it's done, but it's not done. It worked on my machine. I didn't have time to do the tests. So all of those things are there, but there's a micro level of failure that happens there, which is an individual working on a small project that takes 3 days and they're struggling to make it work. Mm-hmm. And so at that level, at a peer-to-peer level, they're supporting each other. And we can track based on the timeline of submission, what the progress is. When the code is submitted, it needs to pass certain tests. So that gives us a sense of, is it functionally complete? And we get a sense of how long it took the student to complete it functionally. I described the technical mentorship groups. So the technical mentors are second years that are strong performers that are assigned first years that they mentor in small groups. They have a weekly stand-up where they sign up to do work. And the next week, they do a check-in. What were you supposed to do this week? What did you manage to get done? What didn't you get done? So that exposes also the rate of progress and the rate of understanding. And where clusters of students are falling behind, then we have a single performance manager per campus who would curate workshops to support the student body on where they're getting stuck. So those are the ways that we monitor the progress of the students and stage interventions. First at the peer-to-peer level, which is if what you're struggling with, someone in your peer group knows they can support you. But because we're tracking the data, if we see that, okay, it's looking like it's a bigger issue, we bring an expert in and try to do a workshop to support them to progress. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does answer, and it does feel like you have a very clear process laid out on how you do these trainings and the teaching itself. A lot of questions, a lot of people are asking in the questions, do you have this available, this definition available somewhere so that people can learn how to apply this in their own workplaces, in their own organization?
So yes and no. The curriculum itself is up on our website now. The pedagogy, in terms of the detail of how we're working, we're actually in the process of writing it up now. And we definitely look to share it. Because like I said, our mission is the inclusion and getting more people involved. So I think within the next month or so, we will have the clear write-up of how our tech mentorship model works, how our monitoring of academic performance works, and share that so that other people can apply it in their context. So it is written down internally. We're working on making it publicly available on our website.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it, and to everyone, visit wethinkcode.co.za for updates, I suppose. And one question from Dora, do you follow the success of your students after graduation? Can you say what percentage of them have a job, especially because of your program?
So absolutely. I think when they leave, they become too cool for school. So it's like essentially for me, I get empty nest syndrome every year as one group leaves, and you try to keep in touch and we try to survey and speak to them. So 93% of our graduates end up permanently employed in software development roles with our sponsors. And we're able to track that progress because, like I said, our program is tuition free. So it's funded by the employers of software developers. They pay for the program. And then in exchange, they recruit our students who work for them for at least a year. And so that's how we're able to track the progress, is through the sponsors. Last year, we launched our alumni program. And we get our alumni to come back and speak to students. They do Ask Me Anything sessions. Some of our earlier cohort student graduates are now also mentoring. So we get to speak to them and stay in touch with them in that way. And we survey them on what's going on. But yes, within 3 months of completing our program, 93% of them are in permanent employment.
Awesome. This is just so many awesome questions. I'm trying to filter them. Yeah, so I suppose that people should follow We Think Code, and I really identify with your with the cause that you're leading. This is an amazing cause, and it seems like it not only solves the problems that you outlined in the beginning, which is gender inequality, racism, but also just the ineffectiveness of organizations today. And not sure what question should I ask, because one question from Istvan: at what age do you think students should start getting educated? And actually, my question: what are the ages that your We Think Code supports? Minimum, maximum.
My personal view is that when you start school, you should start to code. I think my view is, years ago, it used to be that reading was this, only the elites read. I think it was the clergy or something, the special people read. And now the world is better for everyone being literate. And I'm now of the view that we need to see software the same way, in the same way that not every person who knows to read is a literary genius and winning a Pulitzer Prize for writing a bestseller, but everyone reads and it's an important tool for them. And I feel that way about code. I feel like in the next decade or so, we should be sitting in a world where everyone has some level of understanding of how code works. But starting from primary school, I think we should be exposing students. Our program recruits youth, so ages 17 to 35. The average age on our campuses is 22. Mm-hmm. But more recently, one of the programs we want to launch is to curate. There's a lot of amazing material out there to teach like high school level learners how to code. So we're looking at curating some of that content and adopting high schools and sending our students into high schools to teach high school learners how to code, to start to actually kind of lift the base of knowledge before they come to us. But I think as soon as you can read and give the kid a computer.
Yeah, and,
right. We service 17 to 35. Yeah.
I was gonna ask that everything that you introduced, like all of these things should be applied to universities, high schools, and even primary schools. Are you in contact with these schools to, push it through in the main curriculum, or do you have any goals? Yeah.
So we actually have a grant that's funding us going into the high schools, this program that I just described, to start to introduce high school learners to code. And then the next thing that we're looking at now is seeing if we can partner with some of the vocational universities in South Africa and take the model we have, because and it's important, and that's why I'm very open in sharing our struggles and our journey as We Think Code, so that people understand that when we approach them with these ideas, it's not from an arrogant, do what we do. It's more from a, you don't have to make all the mistakes, because we've been busy making them in the last 4 years, and we now have some information on some things that work. Let's share them because we want the same things. So like just for the South African context, and I suspect this might be true internationally, our formal universities graduate 2,600 computer science graduates a year. And in the talk, I shared that statistics of 60,000 people that are needed in junior level software development jobs. So the numbers don't match. We Think Code is currently recruiting 450. We're aiming to get to 2,000. There's a big gap there.
Right.
So our view is definitely, if we can put this model in more hands, it's better for everyone. And so we're a nonprofit, and so we're not out here hiding the IP.
I see.
We're a nonprofit. We're here to make an impact. We're tax exempt. The people that give us money literally make us sign that we're going to share these things. And so we're now at that point of stepping out there and trying to make it accessible to a lot more people, because that's the goal. That's the mission.
Nyari, you are leading an amazing cause, and I really identify with it. I suggest everyone visit again, wethinkcode.co.za to apply this to your process, for your family, for children, to push this through to universities. And someone was asking, how can someone volunteer to your organization, others? I think they should contact you, right? If they want.
Yes, please drop a note to info@wethinkcode.co.za. Shameless plug, we are always looking for experts to participate. We're looking for people to curate content, but we're definitely looking for people to mentor our students. And COVID has shown us that the world is a very small place. So even though we're sitting in South Africa, wherever you are in the world, if you've got an internet connection, just like I'm beaming into your living room or office now, you can support our students.
Everyone should do that. Nyari, thank you so much.